Okay. You should have gotten an email from me this morning about midterm grades. It's a very arbitrary thing. Basically, universities started doing midterm grades a few years ago, several years ago, maybe a decade or more, sort of as a retention thing. If you're doing well or doing what you want in the class, it's a nice reminder, hey, you're doing the right things. If maybe you've accidentally let a few things slide, it's also kind of a little kick in the tail or a little wake-up call to get going. The good news is there's a lot of points left to earn in this class. And so those of you who may or may not be doing as well as you want, also feel free to reach out to me. I'll help if I can. But I thought one of the things we would do is talk about upcoming assignments again. I know we've done that, but we have a test that's opening Sunday at midnight, and it's open until 11:55 Monday. So it's open for about 48 hours. This is an opportunity to make points. It's over the last 3 topics we've done since the last test. Sound recording, radio, and film. And there are different things that you're supposed to read over each one, on the website, and then there's a study guide for each one. If you do the study guide, you take the time to do it, you should do just fine on the exam. It's going to be the same format, and so just wanted to point out that's coming up. Also, I want you to finish up your Form 9 and 10. Hopefully you've done the others. I am giving you a grace window though. Any form you want to do between now and say really Wednesday, you'll be fine. Wednesday noon, I'm going to sit down and I can literally go in by name and I can print out all your forms and I'm going to take a look at them and then I'm going to give you a grade out of, they're 5 points apiece, there's 10 of them, a grade out of 50, so you know where you stand. So once I print them out though, no more grace, because really you're supposed to already have them done, but I'll give you till like noon Wednesday. And don't forget your film treatment is coming up, but focus on the test. Again, you see here there's there's the origins, there's these 3 things that you're supposed to read about sound recordings, and then the study guide. So I hope that you've been keeping up. Well, if nobody has any questions, the way the class has been structured, what I primarily do is you have those, like, there are 3 little, really brief descriptions of each topic that you're responsible to read on the website. And then I've been bringing in other chapters from the book that talk about other things that are related, but it's not the exact same content because I don't want to bore you to death to have you read all that. And then, but I decided in honor of our test that's coming up, I just made these up this morning of some of the really important concepts of all 3 topics, and I thought we'd spend 20 minutes on each. Kind of, I wouldn't say it's a review, but it's something like that. And so I thought I'd just start with sound recording and talk a little bit about that. Anybody have any questions before we move forward? Okay. I got you, Nairobi. Can you tell me who's in the back?
Dylan.
Okay, because we take and roll. I want to make sure you get credit for being here, Dylan. Okay. So, your study guide mentions these 2 gentlemen, and again, the Moodle page has quite a bit of information about them. But they were key people to sound recording. This is a picture of Thomas Edison here. And in 1877, he invented the phonograph, which is the forerunner to, the record player, which is a forerunner to all the stuff we have today. And Thomas Edison was a really interesting guy. They said he barely ever slept, and because he was just always full of ideas, and because he didn't sleep much, he was always inventing things. And he had a lot of patents on a lot of different inventions, but the phonograph was one. He invented other things as well. Berliner came along and improved on the phonograph, and in 1887, 10 years later, he gave us the gramophone, which was basically just kind of an improvement on it. And he's associated with RCA Victor. So these are just two guys on the study guide. I just kind of wanted to point them out. We talked about Marconi and the wireless radio back before the last test. And one of the things that made sound recording and radio possible was the sound wave. In 1956, rock and roll is at its height, and part of it is that we have the capacity for stereo. And I just wanted to show you some of the different kind of inventions and evolutions. Hi-fi or high fidelity became a technology in 1958, and you could record the plastic tape, which was something new. I'm going to pause here. This is kind of new. I didn't do this for the last test, so this is meant to help. But again, I would focus on the study guide. If this helps me with the study guide, that's what I would do. Multiplex radio comes along, and that's where mono and stereo are together. Transistors are part of the 1960s, so you can see how the technology begins to change. Transistors begin to have tape tracks that are marketable, and we have 4-track and 8-track. 8-track didn't stick around very long. I remember the 8-track era. And then tape cassettes. In 1979, Sony came up with the Walkman. This is neither here nor there, but my brother was a big runner when we were younger. And before 1979, he came home one day and he said, somebody really needs to invent music that you can take with you, because he would carry a little transistor in his pocket. And I reminded him several times that he should have followed up on that. We would be rich right now. But somebody else came along, and Sony in 1979 and invented the Walkman. And then, of course, CDs and iTunes and music downloading. You can kind of see kind of the progression of sound, the various sound waves and how we've captured it. There's different ways to make money in the music business, and this one slide doesn't do it justice, obviously. I'm just trying to hit kind of some highlights because I'm going to do all 3 of them today. But there's direct sales. You can go, they go on tours and they sell tickets and they sell, CDs and they sell T-shirts and things like that. The 1980s, one way that people marketed themselves heavily was music videos. MTV and different shows like that would really help market different artists. Licensing became an issue because when can you use somebody's music and when do you have to pay for it, that kind of thing. In 1914, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers were formed, and they formed to kind of help protect the artists. They enforced royalty payments from radio, and they came up with a blanket licensing fee. So as you can imagine, if you were a radio station, if you had to pay every time you played the same song, you couldn't afford for it. So they came up with a licensing fee that they had to pay in order to use these various songs. And that helped protect the artists from radio stations that didn't want to pay. In 1939, BMI was founded, and it was a licensing group that really radio preferred. Radio plays only licensed music so that they don't get sued for copyright infringement. People get up in arms about recorded music because music is one of the most powerful mediums there are. You know, you think television's powerful, you think film is powerful, but music really does a lot with emotion. And because of music, those other mediums we just talked about, TV, film, radio, are more powerful and influential. And so sometimes parents get really concerned about their children hearing certain lyrics. And I don't have children, but I can imagine why, especially if they're a certain age. Once they become, you know, adults, that's different. So the Parents Music Resource Center was founded in 1985, and it wives of a lot of different politicians that wanted warning labels on music for explicit lyrics. The Recording Industry Association of America, which I know is on your study guide, its member companies control 95% of the recorded music, and they deal with labels and that kind of thing. So those are just a couple of the important entities involved. We all know about pirated music. Hopefully we don't do it. Illegally downloading music without paying for it. These statistics are a few years old, but there's illegal overseas copying with about 20% of sales are lost. $1 billion in lost income. Again, this is a few years old, so I bet it's actually higher. But internet file sharing has made it easier to steal music. The RIAA fights back and they sue file sharers. So that organization tries to protect the artists. There's been cases that have gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court did rule in this court case that file sharers could be sued for copyright infringement. I think in most cases, they're not that interested in really suing it doesn't say there, but several hundred people. They're trying to make a point that people should stop and that we can sue. Because you can imagine, if it was you, if you were the artist, you would want to get money for your work. I'm an author and I don't make very much on my books because they're academic books, but I want that, whatever it is. I don't want somebody photocopying my book and getting away with it. Technology has really changed things a lot since Edison and Berliner first came up with their inventions. We have digitized music. It's transferable and easily available, and therefore also easy to steal. The technology has both helped and hurt the recording industry. How has the technology helped the recording industry? You guys are consumers of music. How's it made it better?
It's more accessible.
Okay, it's more accessible.
Yeah, it's easier to get to. And then I know, I think on Spotify, you pay like a membership fee so you can listen to music and have to skip or so they're making money off of that.
Okay. What else? Anything? Yeah.
I think it makes it easier to find new music.
Okay. Helps because it's easy to search for it, right? Okay.
It probably helps just the recording industry itself for recording music because everything is, I think the technology to record music is a lot more accessible to a lot more people now than it was before.
And the quality of the digital recording is just so good. So it really has done a lot, but it had their, you know, it's kind of had the good bad where then, you know, people, it's also so much easier to steal the music. And so that's hurt the industry some. There's no way to really police the internet though. If there's a serious case, I guess you can bring a lawsuit, but you know, the internet is still kind of the wild, wild west. And so there's not much the music industry can do about it. And I you know, I'm not really somebody who's studied music business and understand the structure. If there's a way to make people pay for all the music, that's what we should do. But it's harder and harder to do that. I told you these were going to be really quick, kind of flyby. Any questions about any of that? Okay, let's do a new share. Well, radio, one of the things about it is it's so accessible and pervasive. It's everywhere. According to statistics, 99% of homes have radios. You know, there's probably 1% of a home they can't afford it, but it's ubiquitous. It's just everywhere. Almost every car has it. And 4 out of 5 adults driving are perceived to listen to the radio. You can see how many listen between 6 a.m. and midnight. 7% of bathrooms have radios. You can buy them for your shower. They're supposed to be waterproof, and you can listen to the radio in the shower. I bought one once just because I do love music, and I don't know, mine didn't work very well. I needed to buy a better quality one. And so radio is really pervasive. We think of it as being less influential than it was since television, you know, came out. But the truth is, it's still there. It had to reinvent itself in order to survive, like a lot of the other mediums that we've studied. Newspaper was king, and then magazine came along, and then radio, and then film and movies, and they all had to adapt when the next one came along. The internet's affected all of them. And so it's pretty much an everyday accessory. Not to be too redundant, but when we talked about Marconi coming up with wireless technology, even though the telegraph and the telephone have wires, the whole notion is that sound travels across the wire. And telegraph and telephone were very important inventions to help us get to Marconi's invention of wireless technology. They had their limits. You had to go across wires, and the telegraph, sometimes the lines would break, that kind of thing. If you're watching an old Western movie, the bad guys cut the telegraph wires. So that happens a lot in the movies. Radio begins to kind of get involved. Marconi is considered sort of the wireless breakthrough. Hertz is a guy who was working to try to bring about different inventions too. Marconi is usually considered the inventor of radio, although it took several people for radio to be invented. He invented the wireless part, the fact that sound could go through the air. But Marconi was really interested in point-to-point communication, somebody calling somebody else, like on the Titanic, a distress call from the operator. But he didn't really envision radio the way we know it. We had other people who came along and did that. So Marconi has his wireless breakthrough in 1890, and in the early 1900s, we have a lot of experimenting with what could be radio. Reginald Fessenden began having different experiments and trying to just, have different things go out over the airwaves. DeForest came up with something called the Audion tube that was really important in helping advance radio. DeForest is considered one of the group of people who helped invent radio. And David Sarnoff was the guy who saw the vision of making radio something for the people. David Sarnoff is a very influential pioneer. He saw the value in radio and the value in TV, and he was a pioneer in both. He also was, did take a distress signal from the Titanic. He worked as a radio operator. So we've talked a little bit about this before too, that the airwaves are more regulated than print media. One of the reasons is there's only so many frequencies. Anybody can buy paper and ink if they have the money and put out a newspaper. But there's only so many frequencies. So the government regulates electronic media. And the Radio Act of 1912 created a system by which people had to be licensed, and then they were given a frequency by the government. In World War I, the government took radio kind of back. They took control. They were afraid to let people use radio because it was so experimental. They didn't want somebody tipping the enemy over the airwaves about something related to the war. And then when the war was over, the government gave back radio to the public. RCA 1919, basically they were kind of given a private monopoly by the government. And David Sarnoff became the general manager of that group. Oops. So as they began to experiment, one thing they did is they would broadcast to each other little things. They would call each other and broadcast. In 1920, we have our first commercial radio station, KDKA in Pittsburgh, where they would broadcast 1 hour each night, something. They broadcast from a guy's garage. And then they would sell an ad for it. And what they were surprised by is that people would buy the ads. And so it really became very profitable very quickly. People wanted to advertise. So this is a picture of David Sarnoff. And we have another group that deals with the blanket licensing of music broadcast over radio. And WEAF New York and advertising, they were kind of the first, had the first commercial sponsors, and it really, really caught on quickly. Government kept working at how to regulate radio. They had a new law passed in 1927, and they created the Federal Radio Commission, and then they created the Federal Communication Commission in 1934. And that group issues licenses, and they also regulate different things. The FCC regulates TV and radio. It's hard for us to imagine because we're a visual culture. You guys grew up with the internet. You grew up with television. I grew up with television. Internet entered my life later. But radio was a very, very powerful force when it first came out in the 1920s. It was kind of like this new national experience because you had newspapers, magazines had become a national medium because you could read something in New York at the same time somebody read something in LA. But radio was the first time that no matter where you could hear something at the exact same time that everybody else heard it. And it really kind of created a sense of community. It became a very cultural and political force. That's why FDR's fireside chats were so significant. Franklin Delano Roosevelt gave chats as if he was talking to Americans in their living room. They became known as fireside chats, and they were incredibly powerful. One could almost argue they were a key to him having 4 terms, the only president we've ever had to have more than 2 terms as president. The programming was sponsored. You had basically comedy, music, serials, drama, and news. Prior to television coming into the popular culture in 1948, you had radio serial programs. You had I Love Lucy was on the radio first. Gunsmoke was on the radio first. And so there were dramas and people would sponsor them. Later, when television comes along, they rip off those formats. And radio has to kind of reinvent itself because they lost their programming. How many of you guys have heard the War of the Worlds? Anybody? You can go online and hear it today if you just type it in. This is Orson Welles. He was a famous actor and director and producer. And he produced and acted in a movie called Citizen Kane, which is considered by many to be the greatest movie of all time because of its influence on later movies. He had different techniques that he used. But he also had a program on the radio called the Mercury Theater on the Air. And they did a weekly broadcast. And he and other actors would act out a play or some kind of, dramatic performance. And for Halloween in 1939, they decided that they wanted to take H.G. Wells' book, War of the Worlds, they weren't related, and put it like a play on the radio. So they were performing early in the week, and Orson Welles said, this just isn't scary. I'd like this to kind of scare people. And so at this time in 1939, one of the things that had happened with radio was we had breaking news. It was something that we'd never really had before. So you could be listening to a program and something could interrupt it and say, breaking news, the Hindenburg just exploded, or breaking news, this just happened. So Orson Welles said, let's take H.G. Wells' play, which is about Martians landing on Earth and taking over, and let's do it like it's breaking news. And so what happened was about 20% of the people who heard it believed it, which is kind of hard to believe, but it's true. They said 1 in 5 people who heard the broadcast believed that Martians were on Earth and that we were all in peril. And a lot of them, called loved ones and tied up phones. Some people tried to flee. It was really a mass hysteria. Now, one thing that they had done is at the beginning of the show, they said this is a reenactment. This isn't a real news broadcast. But just like we channel surf today, they were channel surfing the radio, and a lot of people missed that. And I wish we had time to listen to it because it is very real in that day. I think one of the reasons people could believe in 1939 that there were Martians is we hadn't gone to the moon yet. People did wonder about life on other planets. People fantasized about it, wondered about it. We didn't have science on it. I think we also didn't have TV and the internet and other things where we could check it. I mean, if we heard today that Martians had landed, the first thing we'd do is grab our phone, right? They didn't have that. And radio had not, the news had never really had a hoax before. Now, this again was a dramatic thing, but people believed it. And it was amazingly impactful. And so radio's credibility was hurt by that. Orson Welles got in a little bit of trouble. I think he probably liked it, though, because what it means, it was a pretty good play if people believed him. But the War of the Worlds showed the power of radio. They broadcast a fake news story that was a play, and people believed it, people panicked, and there was just utter bedlam. And so that's just a kind of an important moment. I'm pretty sure that's on your study guide. Nobody's seen that? Sometimes people listen to that, or not seen it. People listen to that in high
I've
school.
heard some of it.
Yeah. I mean, because we're such a visual culture, it is hard to listen to the whole thing, but it is well acted in its day. Different networks were created on the radio, and these are just a few of the different people. David Sarnoff was with NBC. William Paley goes on to be very famous with CBS television, but he is with CBS radio. And then NBC Blue becomes ABC. They're just different ones. And again, the Moodle page kind of talks about some of this. The three original radio networks lasted until about 1980, and now we just have all kinds of fragmented presence on the radio. So radio comes along, and in the 1920s, it is very powerful. It's still powerful, but television comes along in 1948 and steals some of it. Because not only can you hear something at the same time everybody else hears it, now you can see it too. And I don't know if you've ever seen old episodes of The Waltons, which is a really old show, but every now and then they would gather around the radio to hear news or listen to a show. Well, Armstrong is a person who's also associated with radio, and he is associated with FM, and it's a clearer sound. And disc jockeys and BMI become significant. Disc jockeys become popular for playing the different music and introducing it. Gordon McClendon is the guy who created format radio. And format radio means the different format your station is. So we're a country station, we're a rock station, we're a talk show station, that kind of thing. McClendon's the guy who came up with that idea. Radio is associated with cars and clocks, and so there's a drive time audience, so sometimes advertisers will try to have ads during drive time. Payola and talk show scandals. There was Alan Freed was a disc jockey who got in trouble in the 1960s because he agreed to pay your records if you paid him. And so, you know, if you paid him enough, he'd play your songs. And of course people would do that, right? Because if you get airtime, then your song goes, you know, becomes a hit and you sell more records. But it became kind of a scandal. Disc jockeys were supposed to play the best music for their audience, not supposed to, you know, get paid extra. One of the things that one of the things that radio did is when it lost things like dramas and that kind of programming to television, they began talk radio, and talk radio is really big today. I mean, it still may be a kind of a small portion of the share, but it's still big enough that it makes a difference. And talk radio can be very influential. Don Imus has been kind of what they call a shock jock, a guy who just says really outlandish things just to get you all ticked off and angry. And he's always in some kind of scandal for something he said. One particular scandal, he insulted, I can't remember the college now, but he insulted the women's basketball team from a university, and it was very racist what he said, and so he got in trouble for that. TV comes along and radio is less prominent. There's no question about it. That number's a little bit old, but we have some stations that are FM and some stations that are AM. Let's see. I don't know how much of that you need to know for what's on your study guide, but radio became less and less prominent thanks to TV. But ready-made formats is kind of one of the things that helped save radio, Because it's like, if we can find a niche in the market, then we'll find an audience. And so news and talk is a ready-made format. Radio station that's news and talk is usually exclusively so. Larry King, Rush Limbaugh are examples of those. Is Rush on anymore? Okay. The only reason I ask is I know he's been sick.
I know he's been sick, but
I think he's still on, because I think if he wasn't, we would have heard.
Yeah.
I don't listen to radio as much as I used to, despite what I've been saying. I think people do, but okay. Adult contemporary music, contemporary hit, so top 40 music, country. So there are people who only want to hear country. There are stations dedicated to that. There are Spanish language stations. So one of the answers to television was creating a niche in the marketplace. And this is just shows you, kind of generally speaking, how popular they are. News talk's pretty popular, adult contemporary. Oldies, I like oldies music, maybe that makes me old. I know that was just kind of a cursory run through. Hopefully you've been doing your reading and you've read those chapters. I mean, not chapters, those little things on the middle page. I confess, one of my favorite things in the world is film. I just love the movies. I love going. I tell Fred Jones, about once a semester, I need to go back to school so I can become a filmmaker. I'm really just a fan. And then because I teach mass media, I'm studying them. But I love film. I think film really contributes tremendously to our society. And anybody in here a film major? Minor? Okay. So, what in the early stages, and again, we're just kind of doing a drive-by on this stuff because I'm counting on you to read the assignment. But early on, part of what the dream was to catch motion on film. You can see here, movie brings sequential photography. The notion is if you can catch movement on the film itself, and he is associated with sequential photography. The kinetoscope, again, we see Thomas Edison's name. He invents everything, it seems like. And he helps invent the kinetoscope. Dixon invents perforated film with sprockets so you could advance the movies. The peep show viewer today is kind of associated with kind of adult movies, but a peep show viewer really was you would stand there and you would watch the movie, and it was called that because you peep into it. It didn't have any, negative connotations at all. The problem with it though was only one person at a time could see the motion. And so the peep viewer was looped on rollers, and you could look in and you could see it moving. But as you can imagine, you're not going to sell millions of dollars of tickets years later if people have to view the movie one person at a time. The first kinetoscope parlor was in New York City in the late 1890s. The Lumiere brothers come along, and they want to show movies up on the wall or on a screen so that multiple people can see the movies at once. And so they came up with a camera and a projector. It was portable and it was hand cranked, but it was projected on a large screen. So it took it from the peep show to the show that people could see. And so the first motion picture show was in a Cafe de Paris in 1895, and they showed short films, and it was called Lunch Hour at the Lumiere Factory. Edison also is very interested in film, and he has a premiere in the late 1890s as well, and he works on a variety of motion picture patents. George Méliès produced A Trip to the Moon. A Trip to the Moon is a very influential movie because it's the first time that they attempt to use special effects. Now, it's no Star Wars or Harry Potter or, I don't know, some modern movie with special effects. They would do something like somebody's holding a broom, they'd pause, they take the broom away, oh, the broom disappeared. That's kind of an exaggeration, but it was that kind of crudeness. I don't know if there was actually a broom in a shot, but you get the idea. They tried to use trick photography, but that's an important movie because they tried, well, they did use a crude form of special effects. Edwin S. Porter worked for Edison, and he is known for the Great Train Robbery in 1903. The Great Train Robbery is an important film because it had actual scenes where there were dissolves and action, and you can see that online as well too. If you want to see the Great Train Robbery, it's a very brief little movie, but you can watch it. And so it was a big deal because it had action and had dissolves and that kind of thing. So those are a couple important early movies. The Biograph was one of the first film studios, and Florence Lawrence was the first movie star. I'd laugh at the name, Florence Lawrence. But she's considered the first movie star. In the early days of the movies, the studio system kind of owned stars, if you would, kind of like baseball teams own pitchers and catchers. They basically would find talent, discover them, have them sign a contract, and then they were exclusive to that studio and they had to make a certain number of movies. Before I really learned about the studio system, I always wondered how some great actors of this era would make a great movie and then a terrible movie, and then a great movie and then a terrible movie. Well, the studio system had them on the hook for a contract, and so sometimes they would do movies they didn't want to do, and the studios knew that they would more likely sell if they had a good actor or actress in them, so they would have them do that. Down the road, some actors, directors, and producers got together and they became independent and they kind of broke up the studio system. It didn't happen overnight, but now stars are kind of more free agents. The Birth of a Nation is another significant movie. It was made in 1915. It's the first feature-length film. It was a big budget movie, and it was D.W. Griffith made this movie, and it was kind of a big deal because it was the first full length, but it was an incredibly racist movie. It was about the KKK and the Civil War period, and it was a very offensive movie. It's significant to movie history because it's a feature-length movie. Noble and George Johnson, they did narrative movies or race films for an African-American audience, and they were kind of known for that. Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, and D.W. Griffith decide that they're going to form independent artists in order to kind of buck the studio system. That's why they're pictured there. Around 1919, several things happened that kind of changed the industry, that period. The movie industry, for one thing, moved to Hollywood. It was in New York and decided to go to Hollywood for a couple of reasons. One, the weather was better and you could shoot year round. There was land out there to be had. And so the owner of the LA Times sold some lands to some movie studios and they moved out there and they could shoot year round and they were able to make more movies. Another interesting concept that I know is on your study guide is block booking. And that's where theaters would sign up to show dozens of films as a single package instead of a single movie. So if I owned a movie theater, I would, from the people who made the movies, I would bring in like 20 at a time, even if I didn't want them. I couldn't just order one movie. And so block booking really gave an advantage to the studios that made the films. So the studios made the films and then they made the theaters buy more than they wanted sometimes. And so block booking gave a tremendous monopoly to the movie producers. So block booking eventually goes away, but theaters eventually are able to stop that practice. In 1919, United Artists was founded so that there could be independence in the movie industry and that the studios didn't, again, own the actors like you would own a football player or something like that. The movie industry, like the music industry, people have wanted to regulate for different reasons. And so there were some early scandals. Fatty Arbuckle got involved in, he was an actor, and he got involved in kind of a sex scandal. Then there was a murder, and these were associated with Hollywood types, and it was in the news, kind of gave Hollywood a bad name. The Catholic Legion of Decency led a boycott. Sometimes there were different boycotts against the movie industry. And so what the motion picture industry decided to do was they said, look, if government won't regulate us, we'll regulate ourselves. And they created in 1922 something called the Hays Office. And the Hays Office kind of oversaw content. And there were standards that the movie industry put in that tried to keep movies decent so that other people like the Catholic Legion of Decency wouldn't step in and boycott them or have government regulate them. Matter of fact, moving back for a second. Surely everyone here has seen Gone with the Wind, right? Maybe. It's a classic. There's a, one of the lines at the end is when Clark Gable says to Scarlett O'Hara, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. That was scandalous when he did that. And I think that movie came out in 1939. And one of the reasons it was scandalous is it was a violation of the Hays Office. You weren't allowed to curse in movies. And the people who made Gone with the Wind said, we don't care. We're going to have Clark Gable curse. And so it was very heavily regulated for a long time. The first talking movie was The Jazz Singer by Al Jolson. You can see bits of that online too. I don't know if the whole thing's available for streaming. Vitaphones basically had 7 shorts with sound, so like short films, but Jazz Singer was the first full feature movie. Now, I went out and rented it. I bought it. I don't think I have it anymore. But a lot of The Jazz Singer is like a silent film in that there's a lot of animated overacting, and then there's subtitles. But somewhere in the middle of the movie, Al Jolson speaks. And it's the first time that ever happened in a feature film. And there's not a lot of speaking in it. I was kind of disappointed. They still had trouble synchronizing the sound with the, you know, the movement of the mouth. And so they did it and they perfected it. It became the way. But this particular movie, the first feature-length talkie, it is, but there's not a tremendous amount of talking in it. By 1933, though, they get it down pretty fast, just 6 years later. Talkie kind of dominates and silent films go away. In fact, I think the movie Singing in the Rain is about silent film actors trying to adjust to talkie movies, because it is very different. I'm going through this stuff pretty fast. Any questions? Or hopefully our friends are still with us at home. Looks like they are. There are several movie moguls, and by that, the sort of the big five. In the 1930s, there were 5 big studios: Warner Brothers, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount, RKO, and 20th Century Fox. They made up for about 2/3 of the ticket sales in the 1930s. I know that your Moodle page talks about vertical integration, so make sure you read about that. Basically, stars, directors, writers, and staff, they had sort of production stables, and they own production and distribution, and that's called vertical integration. One of the things that's kind of interesting about movies and the Depression is that, you know, movie sales did go down, but not as much as you might think. It went down a little bit, but it didn't cut out altogether. And if you've ever known anybody who grew up in the Depression, it just changed them forever. I had a boss, he has since passed. He was a wonderful man, but he was kind of, I shouldn't say this now that I'm being recorded, but he was kind of a cheapskate, sort of. But he wasn't, because he had a generous heart. But he was always kind of afraid, and it's because he was a child in the time of the Depression. So to think that people did go to the movies during this period of time, Disney was going in 1928, and Snow White and Seven Dwarfs, our first full-length movie. During the Depression, one of the things that the movie theaters did to get people to come is they had bingo nights, they had dish nights. If you come, we'll give you a dish. And they would have double features. So you come and you get 2 movies. And so people came. And I think one of the main reasons that people still went to the movies during the Depression was that, you know, they still needed an escape. And movies provide a tremendous escape. The movie industry has labor unions, the Screen Actors Guild, Writers Guild, Directors Guild. The golden age of movies, MGM kind of reigned supreme. They had blockbusters like Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind that came out in 1939, and they had really good use of color in those particular movies. Those movies stand up today. You can watch them over and over again, and they're as good as any movie made today, if not better. 1941 is when Orson Welles made Citizen Kane. It was a movie about a newspaper publisher. It was really about William Randolph Hearst, who was a real newspaper publisher. And this movie kind of mimicked his life, if you will. And William Randolph Hearst tried to keep the movie from being shown. It wasn't a biography or anything like that, but you had a newspaper mogul named Charles Foster Kane, and you had a newspaper mogul called William Randolph Hearst, and there were a lot of parallels between the 2 men's lives. It has been voted the greatest film of all time because they've done different things with like shadows and framing and dissolving and things that hadn't been done in movies before. In the late 1940s and 50s, movies were under assault because of the Red Scare, the McCarthyism. People were really afraid of communists, and they were afraid that they were in the State Department, they were in the government, but communists were in the movies, right? And so there was a big fear about that. And so McCarthy had the House Un-American Activities Committee during the Cold War, where he had a lot of people he suspected were communists. And the Hollywood 10 were some people who were called up to testify about communists in the movie industry. And you could get blacklisted, and then you were not allowed to work in the movie industry because you were presumed to be a communist. You didn't have to really be one. Somebody just had to name you. And there's some really good movies about that as well. The titles of those movies escape me now. In 1948, there is a court case, U.S. versus Paramount Pictures, where the court said that you had to limit block booking to 5 movies. So you couldn't make them take dozens and dozens. The court also ruled that you had to stop, from the studio's perspective, blind booking, that you can't send, the studios couldn't send theaters movies that they didn't know what they were getting. That was a practice. And so you can see these other things, but studios stopped buying the movie theaters. For a while, studios owned the studios that made the movies, they distributed movies, and then they owned the theaters that showed the movies. So when you read about the block booking and the blind booking and verticality, it has a lot to do with the fact that studios owned everything. So make sure you read about that. And that's film in a nutshell. Any questions about that? Anybody have any questions at all? Anybody home? You guys doing okay at home? I'm assuming you are. I haven't heard from you. So that's what I have for today. So I'm going to shut off the video. Come clean your seats. Don't forget to take the test Sunday or Monday. And I hope you have a good weekend.